No, they are going already. Is that what you want? Should I just start? Then you can pause it. Yeah, I think you can. I think we can start unless it doesn't look like there is anybody else, so I might as well. Yeah. I think the recording will be more valuable than anything else then. Okay. Is it being recorded?
Yeah.
It is being recorded.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'd like to welcome all of you to this very special event that we are doing here. And I'd like to begin by thanking Namrata Jain, the graduate assistant of the Center South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies, for making the logistical arrangements that has made this event possible. We gathered here, as you are aware, to commemorate the memory of our very dear friend, certainly my very dear friend, Sara Suleri, Goodyear, who passed away peacefully this past sort of, it was in March, after an extended illness. Like members of her family, it's taken a while for me to process her untimely departure and muster up the courage to try and organize this modest tribute for Sara. I hope her younger sister, Philip, who said she would be with us virtually, is on. And Philip, I hope you are there. And I must thank her for kindly sharing with me this lovely photograph of her beloved sister. In planning this memorial event, there were many options. I was inspired, however, by Sara's own words in, her unforgettable opening words of her excellent, her book, Excellent Things in Women, a memoir of post-colonial Pakistan, which she begins by saying, leaving Pakistan was, of course, tantamount to leaving the company of women. A master stylist, certainly the best, I think, stylist in the English language Pakistan has produced. Sara never gave up the company of women, let me put it that way, even after moving to the United States. I myself did not know Sara in my childhood. I came to know her here in the 1990s. And so I think when I was thinking of how to start this, I thought, what could be better than for Pakistani women to claim Sara? And, she is, one of our most talented and accomplished sisters. And I think one whose company we will miss, we are already missing, and what is more, we are mourning. But we are now ready, I think, to find ways of remembering and cherishing and celebrating Sara and her work, which will continue to inspire, regardless, a generation of students, especially those who work in the field of post-colonial studies. There are many others here, including Shazia sitting right in front of me, more qualified to assess Sara's work in the field of post-colonial studies. So I'll leave that to you. We'll begin today with two interviews that I carried out this summer, one with Professor Shaista Sirajuddin and the second with Dr. Nasreen Rahman. I'm grateful to them for agreeing to share their thoughts and memories of Sara with me. These two Zoom interviews were conducted, as I said, this past summer and constituted an important moment for me in coming to terms with the fact that Sara is no more and that the phone will not ring. It hasn't been ringing for a while now for me to hear her unmistakable voice softly saying, "Hello, Aisha, this is Sara." What a loss. That is, I think, can be corroborated by Dr. Azra Raza, the Chang Sung Xiong Professor of Medicine and Clinical Director of the Evans Foundation MDS Center at Columbia University, and a very close friend and collaborator of Sara, who will be joining us, who is joining us from New York via Zoom. Dr. Raza and Sara brought out a co-authored translation and commentary entitled A Tribute to Ghalib, 21 ghazals reinterpreted, which I strongly recommend for those who haven't had a chance to look at. It's a very passionate analysis of Ghalib, and a very novel one too. Also joining us on Zoom today is Professor Amreen Hai, Chair of the English Language and Literature Department at Smith College. She's the author of Making Words Matter, the Agency of Colonial and Post-Colonial Literature, which came out in 2009, in which she examines the work of Rudyard Kipling, E.M. Foster, and Salman Rushdie, with special reference to how a self-reflection, anxiety about agency shapes colonial and post-colonial narratives. She'll be reminiscing today about Sara, who is a doctoral supervisor, academic mentor, and also teacher. And then we are delighted, of course, to have in our midst Professor Nasreen Rahman in person. She's an associate professor of English, specializing in post-colonial literatures at the University of Dayton, and author of Place and Post-Colonial Ecofeminism, Pakistani Women's Literary and Cinematic Fictions, came out in 2019 by the University of Nebraska Press. Although she was not a student of Sara's, Shazia has written on Sara's work, and I think will be invaluable in helping us assess Sara's intellectual legacy. So without much further ado, I'd like to begin with the video interviews before turning to Azra Raza and Amreen Hai, and then concluding with Shazia Rahman's comments and insights. Please join me in welcoming our guests to this event, Sara ki Yaad mein. What? Where is the first one? You need to keep it this way. You need to turn this. Start it. It's not what it is. Not right. What you need to do, where is it? How do I get this? You need to now go to share screen. Now you need to bring this on. Okay, and now share.
And then check optimize.
And then you do this. Sorry. Right? So like this. So welcome to Professor Shaista Sirajuddin, who is a retired former chair of the English department and also head of the dean, rather, of the Faculty of Arts at Pakistan's oldest university, Punjab University in the city of Lahore, where I am right now with her. Shaista has had the privilege, if I can call it that, of having taught Sara, something that none of us can really, we can't go back that far. And what was Sara like as a student? Do you have any memories of her?
Yes, absolutely. I have very vivid memories. She was always very proper, watchful when one taught, and inscrutable. So, yeah. So when one was teaching her, one felt that she was listening politely. But one couldn't see beyond that mask of inscrutability. But then over a period of time, it wasn't very long, I had to teach them Shakespeare. I was doing Othello with them, with the class. She was in a class. And she and this friend of hers, Fawzia Mustafa, whom she very warmly acknowledges in the Rhetoric of English India, they, would say things that were quite provocative, critically speaking.
I see.
So I remember initially I was a little thrown by that, but then I had just come back from Cambridge and I was quite feisty and also had been exposed to views on Shakespeare and Shakespearean tragedy, which were unconventional somewhat. So that was fine. So I taught her in the BA class. And then she went on to join the Punjab University. Earlier, she, of course, was in Kinnett College, which is also a very old missionary college in Lahore. She then joined the MA program in Punjab University, where I taught her for another 2 years. And this continued, except that by then, our social relationship had thawed. And, you know, she would come to tea occasionally and so on. We had a kind of bond, and I'll tell you, the bond was not necessarily an academic one, but her mother and I, her mother was teaching in the department at the same time as Sara was there. And she and I, the mother and I, used to share a room.
Oh, I see.
And yes, we shared a room for many years. Till I went away later on to Oxford and she stayed on and then tragically died. And Ifat, her older sister, who appears on that iconic cover of Meatless Days, she was my contemporary at Kenyatta, and we were together, and we were very fierce rivals in the BA honors literature program. But you know, we were rivals, but not within any hostility. But we were, you know, constantly, you know, wanting to get there. And anyway, so her writing, I found, as I said, it was appropriate. She was fluent, of course. And she never shirked. The work was always, as I said, she was fastidious. But it didn't have particular spark, at least I felt. While she was my student, I found her writing to be more than satisfactory. She was always particular. She knew her subject, all that. The fluency was there, but it lacked spark. It lacked spark. There was something almost blandly correct and spot on. And then, as I said, when she went abroad, when she went to do her doctoral work at Indiana, I think slowly, having left the shores of Pakistan and this city, she found her voice. And one often finds one's voice when one is at a distance from one's own place. It's not like
that's very insightful. That's very, very true. I think it liberated her in a way. I think
liberated her. And she worked on systems. Her dissertation was in poetry, and she was working on the kind of systems that W.B. Yeats and W.H. Auden, 20th century poets, were working within. And I think that in a sense, somewhere, you know, one finds in her critical work, in the rhetoric of Indian India, how these poets worked within certain systems, creative systems. And that became, you know, the stuff of their poetry. Meatless Days for Pakistan, that's the book which is taught here, actually, and people are familiar with it. The Pakistani audience immediately were attracted to a book which they thought was about Lahore and about the family. And I remember talking to her about it when she was here on a visit. And she was very, very insistent on saying that it wasn't an autobiographical work at all.
So how did she classify it then? So
I don't suppose she did. You know, Sara, when she chose to say something, she would say it. When she chose not to say something, she wouldn't say it.
So how do you, as a English literature expert?
Well, it's a classic example of, in a sense, 20th century writing, where there are no boundaries. And what is a memoir can also be a piece of travel writing. It can be autobiographical. It can be fictive.
Yes.
And I think that she found her liberation when she, in a sense, could think of her own family and the people whom she knew intimately as characters.
I see. That's very
And
interesting.
I think, and what I mean is that by fiction, I don't mean that they were false in any way. I think, in a sense, the truth of those individuals was perhaps more communicable with them as characters.
I see.
So
That's
the
very interesting.
characters speak a truth which is very close to, I think, the truth that she experienced and lived with and was part of.
While the world has been charmed by Meatless Days, I think her book, The Rhetoric of English India, has left an indelible mark on post-colonial critical theory. And I wonder how you see it, again, from your disciplinary perspective.
Well, as I said, it's again, it's a very fine piece of work, and I think it stands out not necessarily because it's coming up with things that other writers haven't come up with. I mean, writers who are practicing creative writers as well, like Shoenka and Nogugi, but because it came from Pakistan. I think that was something that was significant, that it was a very substantial piece of critical theorizing to come out from this part of the world, as opposed to India. India has produced quite a lot of critical theorists. So, that, and let me just end by telling you a little incident. I mean, it's without words. So, her mother had passed away. I was at Oxford at that point, and she had come here some time after, and she in that process developed quite a close bond with my mother, who was also an academic, but also somebody Sara somehow took to. Anyway, so on her way back from Pakistan, back to the States, she stopped at Oxford. She called me and she came, and I collected her from the train station, and she spent the entire day with me. She's very thin. She didn't have enough warm clothes on, so I remember lending her one of my cardigans, which she wore. And then we talked about this and that. She didn't talk about her mom. She didn't talk about how she was feeling. And then eventually we ended up in the Scholars Garden in Wadham College. And there's a wonderful beech tree there, very ancient beech tree. And it was a summer afternoon. And we just sat down there quietly, and then we just lay down in the sun, with the sun coming through the beech leaves under that tree. And there was such a moment of tranquility. I remember that. I mean, we were not talking about critical theory or post-colonial this or that, or even about, exchanging chit-chat about Lahore. But sometimes there is a kind of closeness which takes place in silence. And I think that the fondness and the respect that we had for each other was communicated in that silence.
That's just
so I remember her with.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
You have to do the same thing. You understand? Make it big and then stop sharing.
On behalf of the Center,
Stop that, and then go back. How do you do that?
I think hit stop share and then,
Stop sharing.
yeah. Stop share.
Just where next?
And then shares.
Yeah.
Share again. The others, yes. Thank you.
for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies. I'd like to welcome Dr. Nasreen Rahman. Very fortunate to have her here to give us some of her insights about her interactions with Sara over the many years that she's known Sara. Sara spent most of her adult life, Dr. Rahman, in Pakistan. How do you think she related? How do you think she related to the country of her birth?
That's actually a very interesting question, because these days, Aisha, actually, but before I launch into my answer, thank you for your very generous introduction. So to get back to Sara, in these days of hyphenated identities. You're a British, Pakistani, American, Indian, and so on and so forth. And Sara was always sort of quaintly amused, usually amused by this, and said that she couldn't really understand this, and she used to sort of do this, kaun sa Pakistani, kaun sa American, kaun sa Angrez, kaun sa Welsh, and she said, but I feel very Pakistani. So she was sort of very rooted in her Pakistaniyat. And I think part of it was also to do with the family that she grew up in. Not that she always agreed with her dear father, but he was a great Muslim leaguer, sort of quite emotionally attached to Mr. Jinnah. Not that he necessarily abided by Mr. Jinnah's vision of Pakistan, but he did claim, and as a lot of people did, he claimed this sort of affinity with Mr. Jinnah, and she grew up in that. So, and she was always very interested. She kept a very sort of intimate link with what was happening. So she would call up, and she would, want to know what's happening in Pakistan. Wanted to know what was happening with her friends, wanted to know what was happening in the country. And that's why I think it's very interesting that when she writes Meatless Days, it's again a very intimate engagement with family and country. I think Sara was, she was very quiet about her own achievements, as you know. She carried her achievements very lightly. But she sort of finished her PhD at Indiana in record time. And as you pointed out the other day, also got tenure in record time.
Yes.
And, when one said to her, Sara, तुमने इतनी जल्दी PhD कर दी और वो भी अमेरिका से, she would say, सुनिए, मेरी तालीम कैनेड और पंजाब यूनिवर्सिटी में हुई थी. और मेरी बहुत बढ़िया तालीम थी.
I think you might want to translate that for those
Yes.
of
So I was educated at Kennett College, Lahore, and the Punjab University, and I got an excellent education. So when I went to do my PhD at Indiana, I'd done all the groundwork. I'd absorbed it all. But Aisha, I think we both feel it. What a loss.
Yes, absolutely. I just wonder whether you want to share some thoughts on her view of the fictional productions from Pakistan, because she talked to me at length about those.
Yes, she did. She did. You see, Sara was, she was a magical wordsmith. I mean,
absolutely.
Her prose is just so stunning at every level. It's luminous, it can be very dark, quiet. And so for someone like her, who had such a feeling and for language, and who was so precise with the way she used language, I'm not going to name names, but she was rather disappointed with the fiction that was coming out of Pakistan in English. And she would often say to me, Ke, Urdu mein bataiye, and Urdu mein kya ho raha hai? And, we would often talk about Intezar Hussain, writing in Urdu. And I think, we laughed. One day she read something out to me, in fact, from a Pakistani writer. And she said, ye dekhiye, ye suniye, listen to this. And so she read it and I started giggling. So, and it was quite a serious passage. So she said, see, mixed metaphors, going nowhere, mixed metaphors going nowhere. And so, yes, I think she had a certain, and she did have a love of language and precision and using words.
She's a mastersmith. I mean, I thought she was the best stylist we've produced. And I won't cease saying that over and over again. But I do want to come to my final question for you. I mean, wit and the capacity to make her friends laugh was
Yes.
one of Sara's forte, which you've already hinted at. And I wonder whether you could throw some light on this aspect of her personality.
I mean, she was so quick-witted that sometimes, you forget the things that, she said and that made you chortle with laughter. But I mean, for instance, the episode of the mixed metaphors, the fact that, she can read something, and it was the manner in which she read it out. It was the way in which she used to say things quietly, and also managed to laugh at herself. And, she would fill you up with stories of, when she encountered someone very serious and didn't really realize that, speaking truth to power in a sense, in that very quiet way of hers. And then she'd say, I had no idea that the person was so senior. I had no idea that, I should have been, and she jolly well did. Yes, I think the one thing that I do want to say, and it's important, because it was so important to Sara, she really lamented, it was a lament, the slide and erosion of standards in Pakistan. And roiye zar zar kya kijiye hai hai kyu. It was just, I mean, she really, I think that really used to break her heart. And she would, and of course, she was a reminder that how good the system used to be once upon a time.
Yes, it still, or still could be, if allowed to be. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about.
That you could join us. Thank you so much. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz.
Do you know how to bring on? Is she there? That's oh, there she is. Is she joining us? And
Yes, they both here. They just have to
unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Azra. Welcome.
Adab, adab. I don't know why
Adab, Azra.
my camera is not turning on. I think it
Well, we
needs,
can hear you. It would be nice if your camera could turn on.
yeah. I'm on, it's not allowing me to do it because it says the host has stopped it.
Can you do something about that?
great desire to do something right there.
Change role to attendee. Will that help? Huh?
Could you
Okay.
try now?
All right, you can.
Oh, there you are. Great. Excellent, Azra.
Wonderful. You can hear me.
We did. Yes, we can hear you. I did do a little introduction at the opening, so I think we should just let you speak right off.
Wonderful. Adab, everyone, and thank you so much, Aisha, for giving me this opportunity to speak today. Sara and I were not childhood friends. We met as adults, but the startling velocity with which our friendship took off was directly proportional to the depth of our connection over Urdu poetry. I'm an oncologist. In fact, I've just seen 27 patients, very, very ill cancer patients in my clinic, where I'm speaking from. And I see 30 to 40 such patients every week.
Narration is a central theme in my practice. When I was a young oncologist in training, I suffered a perpetual anxiety about how to make sense of the chaotic, fragmented information that patients provide, especially when the same events as described by patients and then by family members evolve, develop new lives as they travel from mouth to mouth, from week to month, from symptom to sign. What did I miss? What did I not hear? What did they forget to report? How to separate the noise from the real thing, the wheat from the chaff, how to listen more hearingly, the kind of listening that the blind develop naturally, listening for what is not said. And then, of course, how to deal with the soul-destroying moments when people running out of time catalog their swelling regrets, their vanishing options in the maelstrom of disease and disorder. How to develop the self-control and equanimity and be able to follow the advice of Emery Austin, who said, some days there won't be a song in your heart. Sing anyway. In short, narration is a central theme in medicine. Lives depend on what is said and what is heard. Narration was Sara's business. It was her job to make sense of words, read between the lines, acquiring knowledge, critically evaluating the topic placed in context with what is being said. This is exactly what she did. Thankfully, Sara was a deeply poetic woman. Her expression in writing and in our conversation was imaginative, sensitive, emotional, always informed by an exquisite sensibility. Our interests crisscrossed at a fundamental level. As Emily Dickinson said, surgeons must be very careful when they take the knife. Surgeons must be very careful when they take the knife. Underneath their fine incisions stirs the culprit, life. Life itself is the culprit, and it must be accepted, warts and all, along with all its imperfections. And few have addressed the culprit more elegantly, more profoundly than the Urdu poet Mirza Asadullah Khan Wale. For almost a decade before I met Sara, I had been obsessed by Wale and was keen to introduce him to a larger audience, especially to people who inherit Urdu but can only speak a kitchen version of it. Like most of my friends, and practically all of our children, whether they grew up back home or abroad. I wanted to both translate and interpret Ghalib for the larger audience that his work deserves also. So on our first meeting way back in 1990, I knew that Sara was the one to do it with me. And she agreed immediately. So 15 years later, when we finally got to actually doing it, we decided to start with a ghazal that appeared relatively easy because of its short behr or meter. For example, one of the first ghazals we tried our hands on was this gorgeous one. Wo firaq aur wo wisal kahan, वो शबो रोजो माहो साल कहाँ थी बस एक शख्स के तसव्वुर से अब वो राना ये ख्याल कहाँ फुर्सते कारोबार शौक किसे ज़ौक़ नज़ारे जमाल कहाँ और दिल तो दिल वो दिमाग भी न रहा दिल तो दिल वो दिमाग भी न रहा शोरे सौदाए खत्तो खाल का और इतना आसान नहीं लहू रोना दिल में ताकत जिगर में हाल कहाँ हमसे छूटा कुमार खाना इश्क the gambling dens of Ishq, it's like, it's a commerce, it's a gamble. हमसे छूटा कुमार खाने इश्क वहां जो जामे गिरा में माल कहाँ और फिक्र दुनिया में सर खपाता हूँ मैं कहाँ और ये वबाल कहाँ मुज़महिल हो गए क़बा गालिब अब अनासिर में एतदाल का. We understood Ghalib's beguiling force and our mistake with alacrity. Were we wrong in thinking that this would be an easy one to translate? You see, the mystery of Ghalib's poetry is its mirage-like quality. It is most dense when it is most simple. But then the opacity itself became a form of revelation, since it showed to us that translation was impossible without interpreting the meaning. If that is the case, then translation could vary widely depending upon the translator's understanding. And as we consulted other sharas, it was indeed the case. Translation and interpretation were nearly synonymous. We then debated about what our methodology should be. Sara and I agreed that in order to represent the continuum and the dynamic flow that initiates the acts of translation, we should try to complement rather than try and supersede the extant work. As Walter Benjamin wisely observed, just as the manifestations of life are intimately connected with the phenomenon of life without being of any importance to it, a translation issues from the original not so much for its life as from its afterlife. So, as a tribute to the two past masters, Ghalib and Benjamin, we attempted the afterlife of our initial project, Ghalib Epistemologies of Elegance, by returning to a few of the shades that we previously translated and interpreted. Rather than consult our original interpretation, we juxtaposed our second reading onto the first one. Let me just give you one example of the first and second readings from the same ghazal that I just read out. The sher is Fursate karobar shauq kise Zauq nazare jamal ka. Who has the leisure for the industry of passion? It's a commerce, it's a give and take. Karobar shauq. Who has the leisure for the industry of passion? Where is one's longing to behold the glorious? In our first interpretation, we felt that this sher mourns the passing away of a unique vitality that drove the poet to be a witness of wonders. There is no longer world enough or time to engage fully and deeply in the commerce of living, nor is there the fierce longing or the ability to behold the manifestations of beauty. Zauq-e nazare jamal ka. The paradox here is that Ghalib connects the energy of youth with the concept of a certain luxury. Its engagement with the intricacies and demands of passion are represented as a vanished miracle that can no longer be sustained by the sheer vicissitudes of age. But then on our second interpretation, we came up with a different meaning. Taking the sher out of the context of the ghazal-e musalsal, consisting of a group of shers with a common theme, being in this case, Ghalib's meditations on the passage of time and its connections to the inevitability of aging, we came away with a different sense. In the second Misra, Ghalib's use of the word Jamal was quite striking. The word signifies both beauty and radiance and invokes one of the 99 attributes of God. Thus, there are resonances of divinity in the poet's invocation of the glorious. In short, on the first reading, we interpreted the shade relating to earthly delights, while in the rereading, we found it more ethereal. This forces us to revisit the question of Ghalib's translatability. Is he fundamentally inaccessible to a non-Urdu speaking audience? Or does his vitality lend itself to the perpetual struggle between text and reader to exceed the boundaries of one language and intuit that, yes, this is an accurate reflection of what the original means? We hope that our readers would come away with an interpretation of their own, continuing the endless process of rereading. Let me end by saying that I feel extremely fortunate. I feel extremely fortunate that Sara spent so much time with me in the year and a half while we co-authored the book. She was great company, always profound in her serious expressions, and yet at the same time, finding light moments in unexpected places. I'm not implying that Sara and Ghalib were at the same level of greatness, of course. Rather, what I felt while engaged in the translation of Ghalib with Sara was the distinct feeling that both shared much in common in their worldview. Both of them saw through humanity's myriad levels of metaphysical sorrows and yet maintained their ineffable sense of humor. I loved them both because they were artists at heart and yet appreciated the world of science. I know Sara would have subscribed to the pronouncement by Emily Dickinson I'm going to end with. And Ghalib, imagine writing in 1860, he has this share, Tuj se qismat mein meri surate kufle abjad. Kufle abjad is a digital lock. Think of it, talking about a digital lock in 1860s in a ghazal. मुझसे किस्मत में मेरी सूरत कुफले अबजद था लिखा बात के बनते ही जुदा हो जाना. See, as soon as the numbers are right and the lock opens, it separates. How gorgeous is this share? So he understood and took advantage of science and modernity. So I'm going to end with this short thing by Emily Dickinson, which I think both Ghalib and Sara would thoroughly enjoy. Faith is a fine invention. What a line, what a gorgeous line. Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. Sara Zindabad, Ghalib Zindabad, and Tufts University, Aisha Jalal Zindabad. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much, Andra. I'm really entertained.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you please turn on your video?
Amreen? Hi,
Yes.
Amreen. Welcome.
Hi everyone.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was a bit late joining because my Zoom, I think, was outdated, so I had to update it. But
It's perfect. It's perfect. Perfect timing.
great, thank you.
So we've already sort of had a bit of introduction for you. So we'll let you just go straight in and tell us how you know Sara. We all have an idea. She was your doctoral supervisor.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I have actually written out my remarks, so I'm going to read out some of them. But first of all, so I want to begin by thanking Professor Aisha Jalal for inviting me and Namrata Jain for all her hard work in helping to organize this event. So as you know, I am a former student of Sara's, and I'm also a scholar and teacher of Anglophone postcolonial literature and theory. And in that capacity, I will share some thoughts and memories of Sara Suleri as a teacher, as a mentor, and a very remarkable writer and scholar. So when I started as a PhD student at Yale in the fall of 1988, I had never heard of postcolonial studies. It did not yet exist as a field. As an English major at Wellesley College, I had taken a variety of courses, but there was no course offered in those days, in the mid-80s, in postcolonial literature, let alone in Indian or South Asian literature in English. For graduate work, when I chose the English department at Yale, because at that time, I chose that department because at that time I wanted to learn about the full span of English literature, some of which I knew well already, and some of which I wanted to learn more about. I was particularly interested in the English novel, in romantic poetry, and in Shakespeare. I had never heard of Sara Suleri at that time, though she was at that time an untenured member of the faculty at Yale. In my first semester, I took graduate seminars in Old English, 18th century novel, and so on. But when I was looking for courses for my second semester, a South Asian friend, an Indian friend, someone who was studying international relations, not even an English student, and who was excited about taking a new course that had just been announced, urged me to take the same course as him. And that was how I first encountered Sara. That spring semester changed my life. Sara Suleri was teaching a new course, a course that was new to Yale and to English literary studies, called Anglo-Indian Literature, that eventually became the basis for her groundbreaking scholarly book, The Rhetoric of English India, published in 1992 by Chicago University Press. She was a mesmerizing teacher. I remember how full the class was, how a large group of graduate students crowded around the seminar table, rapt, almost stunned by her brilliance. What she taught us was not just new material, but also a new way of thinking, a completely new mind-blowing approach. Unlike other courses that focus narrowly on Indian literature and English, and that might still be taught in some places, Sara's course was designed with a greater ambition and scope, including not just Indian literature and English, but rather the entire arc of the British-Indian encounter. She started with Edmund Burke in the 18th century, included 19th century white women's diaries of their experiences in British India, and ended with path-breaking new South Asian writers from Anita Desai to Salman Rushdie. She did not give this a name, but it was much later she did not give the method a name, but when I looked back with more theoretical training, I understood how innovatively she combined post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, feminism, among others, to create a new mode of critical reading, something that I would call not just post-colonial critique, but something fresh and original, something that was not formulaic. We learned to read texts closely and critically, with and against the grain, for what they said and what they left unsaid, to produce insights that were in themselves new and devastating. She was inventing a new field and a new approach within that. It was as if someone had opened all the windows and doors in the house of Old English Literary Studies, blowing like a tornado through the house of Miss Havisham, and getting rid of the stale air and tired old ways, changing our great expectations, showing us how to breathe afresh and do things anew. Each text was given close attention to produce readings that were astute, unique, unpredictable, and mind-blowing. It was this pivotal course that led me to choose a new area of specialization, postcolonial literary studies. I asked her to be my dissertation advisor, and I worked under her guidance on my thesis on Kipling, Forster, and Rushdie, which became eventually my first book. And it was because of this course and her teaching that I became a scholar and teacher myself in this now established field. But rather than make general statements, I want to tell you a few stories because I love stories. I also work with narrative, and because I think that storytelling is the best way to illustrate something or to get a point across. Sara was not just an amazing thinker, scholar, and teacher, but also an extremely courageous person who was not daunted by convention or authority. She practically reveled in challenging dominant forms of power and stagnant or constricting ways of thinking. I remember that in spring 1989, when I was taking that first course with her, she had invited Salman Rushdie to visit our class. because we were going to read his novel, Shame. Of course, he had just published the Satanic Verses, and you all know what happened on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1989. Ayatollah Khomeini declared a fatwa against Rushdie, and Rushdie went into hiding. He certainly could not come to talk to us. Later in the semester, we read Shame as planned, and for me, that was another turning point in my life. As you know, I am originally from Pakistan and I had been reading English literature pretty much all my life. But Shame was the first novel I read that mentioned Pakistan, or Karachi, the city where I grew up. Introduced to Rushdie for the first time, I fell in love with Rushdie's writing, and I stayed up all night to finish that novel. But in that spring, as copies of Satanic Verses were being burnt all around the world, and booksellers were terrified of stocking it or making it visible on their shelves, it was hard to get hold of a copy even in New Haven. Sara and some of her colleagues at Yale organized a reading where they took turns to read aloud passages of that novel so that more people could hear those words that had been banned and they could hear Rushdie's voice. In that space, at least, Sara made sure that Rushdie would not be silenced. It was a powerful and emotional event. The room was crowded, the chairs had run out, people were standing up, squeezed against the walls. I will never forget Sara's deep, husky voice reading out the section when, in Jibril's dream, Aisha, the butterfly girl, leads her people to the Arabian Sea, and the waters part and they walk across the ocean floor to Mecca. As she ended her reading, Sara burst into tears. I had never seen a professor in tears before. That too was a lesson in how to be a teacher, an academic, a public intellectual, a person of courage and passion, someone who stood up against the abuse of power, censorship, and tyranny for the importance of literature and reading. It remains a lesson that we need now as the right wing in America bans books across the country and puts libraries and librarians under attack. I am still amazed at what a risk she took. She took risks to do what she believed in doing. Another risk, a different one, but a big one still, was writing and publishing her amazing memoir, Meatless Days, in 1989, when she was still untenured, before she had published her first academic book. Sara refused to play by the rules. She eventually, of course, got tenure at Yale, among the first women of color to do so. Meatless Days remains an unparalleled work. It had a huge impact, especially for educated Pakistani women. It showed us something new that was possible, that one could write about one's private life and family in such gorgeous, crafted prose, while retaining privacy, and yet producing such scintillating cultural and historical analyses. I read it the summer it came out with a double lens. First, as an extraordinary text in itself by a Pakistani woman writing about a piece of Pakistan that I did not know. And second, as a window into the life of someone that I did know, my own teacher and mentor at Yale. I still love it. I will not say more about it here because I have written about it elsewhere, but it remains a high point in my life, a work of literature that I have taught many times, and a model of writing and thinking that I continue to draw upon. Many people found Sara intimidating, and she could be that too as a teacher, especially at Yale. But Sara also had an unusual sense of humor. She liked playing practical jokes, often to make a point. Sometime around 1992, Sara was co-teaching a large undergraduate lecture course at Yale with two other faculty, a course on cultural criticism for which I was a teaching assistant. Without warning, one day she arrived wearing a burqa, a large black like thing that covered her from head to foot and also covered her face. She could see through the network patch that covered her eyes, but we could see nothing of her except for her ankles, which indicated that she was wearing, somewhat incongruously and audaciously, a short skirt and blouse underneath. While one of her white male colleagues delivered his lecture, Sara sat at the table up on the stage, along with her other white male colleague, not saying a word. None of us in the audience had any idea why she was doing this or what it meant. We TAs exchanged glances, but remained politely silent and mystified. Inevitably, I remember nothing of the lecture, which was probably undermined at some level visually by her startling and silent appearance as she sat behind her colleague, a riveting, mysterious presence. It made everyone a little uneasy, though no one could say why. Later, the next time we met, she made some comments. She talked about the power of the gaze. But here, she noted, the power was with the person who could not be seen. She could see us, she pointed out, but we could not see her. She did not have to control her expressions as she sat on stage, she said, because her face could not be seen. She could have on any expression, boredom, annoyance, or have any reaction she wanted, but we could not see what that was. She could see us, so we were under the power of her gaze. But our gaze, as audience, could not reach her. It was quite a teaching moment, as she cleverly reversed usual notions of veiling and power about Muslim women and oppression, not just by talking about it, but by enacting it, by staging this performance so that we felt the experience instead of just intellectualizing it. Sara liked to break down and complicate binaries, and that occasion was just one example of how she did that successfully. I have never thought of the veil as simply oppressive since then. I want to end with some important advice that she gave me as a writer and as a scholar, which I still find very enabling. When I was trying to write my dissertation, struggling through the usual anxieties of writing something like that as a graduate student, I had shown her a draft, which was very much just a draft. In one of her laconic pronouncements, she said, quote, "No writing is ever wasted," unquote. In other words, whatever you write is not wasted, even if it does not go into the final version. It helps you think and get there. You cannot revise something into a better version if you don't have a first draft that you might rewrite or throw away. I understood that writing itself clears our minds, helps us to get to the next stage, even if that particular piece of writing never sees the light. She understood, as she says in Meatless Days, the enormous weight of anxiety for many, in fact, the disabling anxiety, the pressures of publishing or perishing that permeated the halls of the university, for faculty and for students alike. It helped release that pressure to know both that she understood this and that she saw writing itself as a way to release the pressures of writing. Sara was an extraordinary individual, a teacher and mentor, and I am honored to join you in paying this tribute. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I think I'd like to promise you to go ahead. I think you can, I don't need to join you. I think you can just sit there. I'll just sit here. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Is that you want to? I think I'm listening to gallery. Yeah, please. This is fine. Yes, you can just focus on her. Can you do that? Well, thank you, Shazia. I think you have quite a bit of follow-up. I mean, been quite a bit already done, so it will be quite fascinating what you have to add to this. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Professor Aisha Jamal and the Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies at Tufts for this generous invitation. And of course, thank you also, Namrata. I was asked today to talk a little bit about Sara Suleri Goodyear's work. I can tell you that in addition to her essays, she wrote a scholarly monograph, 2 memoirs, and 1 book of translation of 19th century Urdu poet Mirza Ghalib with Azra Raza, and it is such an honor to speak at the same time as her. In foregrounding Suleri's work, I'd actually like to begin with my own engagement with her first book, the memoir titled Meatless Days, which came out in 1989. The first time I ever heard of Sara Suleri, and that's what she was called at that time, I was just starting my PhD program and meeting with my professor, Stephen Slemon, about the kinds of questions I would like to pursue in my studies. I don't know what I was saying exactly, but I noticed that he seemed distracted and I worried that I was rambling. Eventually, I thanked him for his time, but as I was leaving his office, he suddenly asked, Shazia, why do you think Sara Suleri ends the first chapter of Meatless Days with the statement, there are no women in the third world? I told him that I have no idea because I haven't even heard of, let alone read this book. And what was it called again? On the one hand, this moment was embarrassing for me since I was trying to come across as a well-read graduate student. On the other hand, Stephen's question led me to read and become engaged with and eventually be truly inspired by Sara Suleri, her critical and creative work, her intelligence and her humor. Eventually, I wrote not only an article with my answer to Stephen's question, but also my own book about Pakistani women writers and filmmakers. Throughout all of what I have done, I have considered Suleri to be a role model, despite the fact that I never had the good fortune of meeting her in person. Reading her work over the years made me feel like I knew her. So to return to my story, when I left Stephen's office that day, I resolved to read Meatless Days immediately, not only to help me think through my own work, but also because I'd never read a fellow Pakistani woman's memoir before. Needless to say, the book blew me away. There were so many aspects of it that I could relate to. As you know, representation matters. The photo of Suleri's sister and her niece on the cover looked just like me and my mother. The description of Dadi reminded me of my own great-grandmother. Suleri's father was exactly like my own great-uncle. Again and again, descriptions of people, of food, of Lahore, all brought back memories in ways that I felt this book was written for me, that Suleri had somehow reached out and touched my life with her own. Even her critique of nationalism was, I felt, completely in line with my own thinking. She gave legitimacy to the thoughts I had been having for years dealing with my own father's nationalism and nationalism in general. The best part was how incredibly funny she was. I laughed out loud at so many moments, even as I wept uncontrollably at so many other passages in the book. This one is particularly moving. In Meatless Days, Suleri writes, and I quote, "But something of our spirits broke in the war of 1971. It was not so much the country's severing that hurt as the terrible after images we had to face. Censorship lifted for a flash, flooding us with photographs and stories from the foreign press of what the army actually did in Bangladesh during the months of emergency that preceded the war. I am not talking about the two-nation theory. I wept to my father. I am talking about blood." He would not reply. And so we went our separate ways, he mourning for the mutilation of a theory, and I more literal, for a limb or a child or a voice, end quote. As a Pakistani woman, these words have stayed with me like an incantation. Limb, child, voice. I was reciting them to myself when I was doing my own scholarly work on 71. Suleri wrote and published these words in 1989, but even today, there are Pakistanis who deny what the army actually did. There are memoirs written by Pakistanis that fail to mention, even briefly, any such thing. When I read Meatless Days, I remember thinking that I shouldn't bother writing a memoir now because Suleri had done it so much better than I ever could. When I did eventually write about Meatless Days, I tried to explain the contradiction between the fact that she had described so many excellent women, her grandmother, her mother, her sister in Pakistan, but had insisted that there are no women in the third world. How? Stephen's voice started haunting my writing. I felt that if I couldn't answer this question, I couldn't possibly write anything of use about this book. But I also couldn't give up because I had to write something about my most favorite memoir in the whole world. Then a feminist critic I really admire insisted that the book isn't a feminist book. This made me want to write in defense of Meatless Days and by extension, Suleri herself. If this book spoke to me as a feminist, how could it not be a feminist book? Eventually in my article, I argued that Suleri was taking a deconstructive stance, that there are no women in the third world because women are different depending on their class, where they live, their age, ethnicity, and so on. The differences between women in the first world and women in the third world are simply too great. As an intersectional feminist, I had a lot of sympathy for what I saw as the nuances of Suleri's claims, as she deconstructed the categories not only of women, but also of nation. To me, this was good, important work. But what Suleri was doing was actually very controversial because feminist analysis at that time really depended on the category of women. As I eventually wrote, no matter how much feminists theorize difference and insist on the intersections of gender with race and class, the category women remains, sometimes in the most tattered and torn form. Suleri's deconstructive stance toward these categories leaves us simply with layers of significance which provide meaning by overlapping, intersecting, and always contextualizing. This too is effective deconstructivist feminist work. After publishing her memoir, Meatless Days, in 1989, Suleri published her scholarly monograph, The Rhetoric of English India, in 1992, which others have also mentioned. And then a second memoir, Boys Will Be Boys, in 2003. Meatless Days appears to be a response to her mother's and her sister's death, while Boys Will Be Boys is very much a response to her father's death. In Asian American literature, Maxine Hong Kingston did the same thing with her two memoirs. The Woman Warrior, Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts, centered her mother and came out in 1975, while Chinaman, about her father, was about her father and came out in 1977. Suleri seemed to be doing something similar with her two memoirs about each of her parents. The difference, of course, is that Suleri is also a scholar. And as my reading of Meatless Days showed, her memoir moves beyond history into the realm of scholarly ideas, particularly deconstructive ideas. While memoirs and scholarly books are usually not taken together, William Ghosh argues that in fact, quote, Suleri's life writing and scholarship respond to the same fundamental questions about writing and description. He finds a clear link between life in post-colonial Pakistan and the ideas about literature and language Suleri professes in her scholarly book, The Rhetoric of English India. I wholeheartedly agree with this analysis and would add to it that what made her remarkable was that the link between her memoirs and scholarship, between her life and her ideas, can also be found in the way she wrote. One expects a memoir to make one laugh and cry, but Suleri's most famous scholarly article actually did the same. I couldn't help but smile when I read these words on the first page of her article, quote, grant me the luxury then of not having to supply quotation marks around several of the terms employed, and since the time of life is short, an acknowledgement that the we to which I'm forced to take recourse is indeed very, very weak, end quote. How could I not keep reading such an essay? And even though I was smiling at the beginning of this essay, I was, of course, outraged and devastated by the end when she discussed the situation for women in Zia's Pakistan. Whatever she wrote, whether creative or critical, Suleri touched us, the beauty of her words, and moved us emotionally. This is, after all, what matters most, I think. We live in a world where the work we all do sometimes feels meaningless because of the pandemic or because of the climate catastrophe or because of ongoing racial capitalism. What can we do, we ask, in the face of such huge problems? Well, honestly, I still look at Sara Suleri for inspiration. And she wrote. She was a writer, not just an academic writer, not just a creative writer, but both. And she translated and interpreted Ghalib with Azra Raza. Her writing and her translations reached and moved an academic audience as well as a larger one. The issues she wrote about were relevant and important, and she never turned away from the world in which we live. She wasn't hiding in an ivory tower. She was engaging. Her last book, Ghalib, Epistemologies of Elegance, was co-written with Azra Raza, and their purpose was to translate Ghalib for, and this is a quote, a generation that can speak Urdu but sadly cannot read its complexities. That would be me. And also to translate in dialogue with each other Suleri's collaboration is impressive indeed, and I am certain that she reached more people because of it. What I have learned from Suleri is that I also have to find ways to write for multiple audiences, to move them with my words, to collaborate with others, because as Suleri said, the time of life is short and words do matter. They can draw your audience in, they can show and tell, they can open hearts. We all have to be able to do more of this with our words. I may never have met Sara Suleri Goodyear, but this is what her critical and creative and translation work has taught me. Thank you.
Huh. Well, it was quite some. Well, thank you so much.
Go there.
Sorry?
Otherwise people can't see you online.
I see. I guess we have time for some comments, questions. This has been a very rich tribute, I must say. I really thank all of you, certainly the three people here, Azra, Ambreen, and Shazia, for an extraordinary sort of, really, it's a feast of Sara's work, thoughts about it. But I still will go, I'll still start with you, if I may, Shazia. What did she mean when she said that there are no women in the third world? I mean, are you quite right in saying that this is because of the inequity of their relationship vis-a-vis the women of the first world, or was she really commenting on something different?
I believe, and obviously she's not here to say,
Yeah.
but I believe that she was questioning, as Ambreen mentioned, she was always questioning these categories. Ambreen mentioned that she was questioning binaries, but I would go so far as to say that she was questioning even more than binaries. She was questioning categories. And
is it the third world women category, or I mean, I'm now sort of not sure whether she's questioning the third world or whether she's questioning the equation of the two.
she's questioning the category of woman, I think, and saying that there are no women in the third world because the category of women would have to include not just women in the third world, but elsewhere as well.
I think that makes sense. She's challenging the East-West sort of easy division. So thank you. I think that's what I wanted for clarification. And Azra, that was an extraordinary sort of treat to hear you speak. But what can I say? I mean, was she a very demanding person to work with, Azra? I just wondered. Was she because, or were you the demanding, or how did it work? I mean, it took you a long while to, bring this project to fruition. You said 15 years. I would have forgotten about it by then. So I want to ask you, what was it like working with Sara?
You came to visit us, remember, in Massachusetts a couple of times.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
When we were together, and I
Is that when you were working?
Yes. So I must reiterate that it is one of the best experiences of my life is to spend any moment with Sara. I am such an unabashed admirer of her. And I think that of all the people I have met in my life, and that includes some of the top intellectuals in both the science and arts, Nobel laureates, Pulitzer Prize winners, I've only met two women who I hold way above as the A team, and everybody else different than them. And Sara was one of them. And it was such a profound experience, Aisha, to see how she would write a sentence. You see, our partnership, I would like to explain this for a moment. We asked Harold Bloom for a blurb. And Harold was a friend of both Sara and I knew him in a different way. But anyway, he called me after he got the book and read it before giving the blurb. And he said, Azra, you say that there are two authors for the book, but there's only one voice. And I said, yes, because you really understood the fundamental complementary nature of our relationship in this book. My forte is Urdu. And I had read Ghalib, Diwan-e Ghalib with 11 sharas in Urdu mehfils that I held at my home every week in various cities over about 10 years before I even met Sara. And this continued for another 10 years before we started our translation. So I felt very confident about my side of it. And then my job was to explain the sher, that this is what Ghalib is saying, this is the interpretation of Nazm, for example, or Ghulam Rasool Meher is saying this, Yusuf Chishti is saying that, Professor Franny Pritchett is saying this. And then Sara would think and say, okay, Azra. Then we would start debating the meaning and interpretation. I many times had to put my foot down and say, Sara, this is not what Ghalib is saying. You have to stop here and rethink this. But then Aisha, once we agreed on a meaning, it was a profound experience to see how she would write the sentence in her mind. And my job was simply, as she called, okay, Azra, now let me put this into difficult English.
That's wonderful. That's what a wonderful insight. I mean, we would never know about this. But I have, if I may ask Ambreen one question, and then let people, others ask questions. You mentioned that Sara was intimidated. Now, this term is used rather loosely, I think, especially for women who are confident and self-assured. So I wonder, can you elaborate what this intimidation is? I found her to be the softest, sweetest human being in the world. That's my view. But what do you mean by the intimidation? That's my last.
That's a good question. I think we all saw different sides of Sara, and actually we all have different sides that we show to different people in our different relationships. And now that I am also a professor and probably older now than she was when I knew her, I'm sure I know students say that about me. And I think about, I think especially as Pakistani women in America, we have to establish authority, and it's always a tricky challenge, right? And I wonder now, because I think Yale, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, was a very toxic place. The Yale English department, it probably still is. I don't think she had an easy time there. I don't think she did. And in order to at once create some boundaries, maintain boundaries, and establish that she was someone to be respected, she had to build some distance between herself and students, as well as between herself and colleagues. And so there was always this kind of tension that I sensed. I mean, I was probably, I was the only Pakistani there. There wasn't even, I don't think in my time at least, there was no Indian woman there either. So we were the only South Asian women in the English department at the time. I mean, I don't know how else to answer that question. I think that's how she was perceived, and I think she had to maintain a certain kind of distance that she needed to.
No, I think that you answered it very well. Thank you so much. But please, all of you have been very patient. If you have any, I'm sure Danielle here, my graduate student, would have many questions.
Sure.
I could feel that you would want to.
Yeah, I mean, this is so beautifully, it's more of a comment as well as a question.
You want to go there?
Yeah, I mean,
Can you hear him?
Can you hear me just fine?
Yeah.
I mean, the comments from the four of you were so richly provided and so evocative that it's so sweet and so wonderful to listen to them, especially coming from the sort of younger generation that wasn't physically present in this, but is hearing this through the words of all of you, and having this desire to go and engage with the text. Dr. Raza, you mentioned the act of rereading Ghalib and picking apart different meanings. And I'm wondering if we engage in the same act with Meatless Days or with other texts, I wonder what other meanings can we interpret. So one of them was questioning the category of women with this third world comment, challenging the East-West binary. What other meanings can we divine from the act of rereading Sara's text?
I will let
Don't-
the
yeah.
professors answer this.
That's very clever. Amreen, it's gone to you. Shazia.
Let me, if I can say a couple of things. One is that, as we know, as literature professors and scholars, that there is no end to interpretation. So there isn't one meaning, and there aren't even two meanings, right? There's no end. So there can be constant. So one of the things I say to students when I teach at the very, very basic level is that there isn't one right meaning, but there is such a, so that you can read things differently if you can find the evidence to support it. But there is such a thing as misinterpretation. If you're missing the grammar, if you're missing the syntax, if you're missing the context. So, which may seem like a roundabout way to answer your question, but I think there is no end to interpreting what Sara is saying, because often her sentences are so beautiful and yet so multivalent that you can constantly reread them and find new things in them. You can also misread them. So that's where we have to be careful. But I would add one more thing I was thinking about when Shazia was talking. And I think, Shazia, I completely agree with your reading of that famous last sentence. But I would also remind us that there is a context. I don't have the book right here in front of me, but I mean, I could go grab it from my bookshelf, but I remember it so well, because at the end of that chapter, which is the first chapter of her book, she describes a scene where a student at Yale, a young, eager white woman, undergraduate, comes to her and asks her why she doesn't have more books written by women on her syllabus. So her answer is actually, that pronouncement is an answer to that question. So you can see where that question is coming from in the 80s. I mean, it is a young woman who has got those categories, right? We should have, I mean, nothing wrong with the question. I mean, yes, we should have more inclusivity. We all know that. But this is somebody who was looking for the token representation, right? And so it's important to remember that Sara's answer is an answer.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, is an answer to it's a resistance to that token representation, and it complicates it by saying, well, what do you want? What do you mean by you want a woman who's going to represent the whole third world? There isn't a single woman.
That's excellent. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Anything further? Kamal, anybody?
Yes.
Namrata, she needs it.
Thank you so much. This was very exciting and engaging.
Why don't you go a little bit closer?
I'm curious about how Sara was conducting her identity as Pakistani American, and also as a teacher of literature who is interacting with students not only of color, but also white students. So I want to understand, how was she presenting herself? Like, we see a very different side of Sara in Meetless Days. We get an insight into her world, into the Pakistani household. But if we were to step away, I would just be curious to know what identity was primary for her.
I mean, there's no question that the Pakistani identity was primary for her, in my view. I will give you a little anecdote, but it's not an anecdote, it's a bit of a confession that, we became friends at a time when I used to wear my starched shalwar kameez. I went through this whole phase and she loved it. She loved it. And she wanted me to wear it more. And then I got tired and bored. Then she would be very disappointed. But I do think that she truly was a Pakistani, and she really, I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, in terms of the answer to you. I mean, that's my view, and I mean, we're all Pakistani, and but I wonder whether I'm right in how I assess that. I mean, she was Welsh as well, but she identified as a Pakistani. My view. What do you think, Azra? I mean.
That's a very interesting question. An anecdote came into my mind.
I think she was a Pakistani.
Very much a Pakistani. I was with
She
her.
made a point. I mean, she was so disappointed when I gave it up.
She may not be the only one.
Can you hear me, Aisha?
Yes, we can, Azra, yes, sorry.
Yes, okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I was going to say that an anecdote suddenly occurred to me that I happened to be attending an Urdu conference with Sara once in New York. And somebody said that, oh, a ghazal has been written in English for a long time. And Sara got very irritated about it and stood up and viciously attacked the person as only she could, very politely. But we knew she's decimating the fundamental concept about this. So the person got very angry and said, well, my Urdu teacher is so and so, and named somebody and said, such and such professor is my English teacher, who's yours? And Sara very calmly turned and said, I don't need an Urdu professor. Urdu is my mother tongue. and simply turned to me and said, let's go and have some coffee, Azra. So she had over things. She made her pronouncement that, you know, she doesn't need to have to over and over somehow authenticate herself as somebody who speaks Urdu. She's a Pakistani. She doesn't need to. And I think that made a huge impression on me, even that she's so at home in this whole identity that she had. And I have to say that Sara was simply the most beautiful person I ever met, inside and out. She was a wonderful, wonderful thinker and had so much empathy, Aisha. Don't you agree with that? She's everything she did.
Absolutely. She was an extraordinary woman, and I wanted to do this only because I think we are just beginning to celebrate this woman. I couldn't for the first few months. It was just too heartbreaking, but I think that she has left a huge amount of work, and I think there's still much to do. But one question that I wanted to share, since I don't think I'll have the three of you there, is a biography of Sara possible without Fawzia Mustafa giving us a good, I mean, you know, because there's a whole aspect of life there that they shared. Did you think anybody could ever write a biography of Sara Suleri? It's a question. I mean, because I do think she deserves one. And I mean, whether it's a literary one or whether a historian's view, I still feel that her life and her relationship with this country does demand some sort of work. And I wonder what your views are. I mean, you know, Amreen, you're an English teacher. You smile. It's a very difficult question, but we won't be together again. So I just wanted to ask whether there's a possibility. I mean, it will have to be planned. And I don't know whether Tillit is there, but we probably can't get her. But I do think.
It's here.
I know Tillit is there because she's texting me.
Anyway, what I'm saying is, would it be possible to do? I mean, you know, there are certain aspects of things that one doesn't write about, but I think in terms of celebrating her life, I wonder whether we can do that and that was the idea of this meeting as well. But I think there's more that we can add. And I wonder whether there's something that, and I would like the two of you, I mean, the English people, to take some, you know, initiative here. But I wonder whether you think about biographies at all, or a study, Sara. Is that going to happen? Amreen is looking very.
I'm just, you know, I'm thinking about your question, and I love your question. I think it's a fantastic idea. I'm kind of curious to know what you mean by saying, is it possible without Fawzia Mustafa?
Because Fawzia was a very major part of her life. And I think that what she says about Fawzia in Meatless Days is fantastic, but there is much more. We need Fawzia's view of Sara. Yes. That's what I mean. And I tried my best to get her today. I tried, but she couldn't make it, which is what I'm saying, that this is a rare occasion to discuss the possibility of such an exercise. I mean, I don't know whether it has to be a joint book or whether, but somebody has to think about it. I mean, it might take us 15 years.
I'm seeing a hand from Nasreen Rahman.
Yes, and there's Jeannie. So yes, of course. Please, Nasreen Rahman. Jeannie.
Yes. Firstly, thank you, all of you, wonderful, fabulous women.
Thank you, Jeannie.
Who've spoken so movingly about our dear Sara. I think Sara was, and we talked a lot about identity, a word that we didn't like, and we often laughed about it. And I think Azra would appreciate this because of her love of Ghalib. Ki bhai insani hai na? Why can't we just be human, you know? Why do we have to be labeled? But it was just a matter of fact that, you know, we were born in Pakistan. That's where we were shaped. That's what we became. That's the identity that we knew. And I think in part because of the racism that we faced, we stuck to it. And we didn't want to be these hyphenated characters, you know, either a British Pakistani or an American Pakistani or a Pakistani American. So that much for, and she was never, I think, parochial. She was a Pakistani, but yet she transcended that. And I remember even as little girls, and I'm 2 years older than her, that even when we were playing, Sara always marked her territory. And it was very interesting, very quietly. And one of the things that she remembered about our first meeting is that she was standing back and I went across and I held her hand and I said, Sara, tum bhi chalo. And, you know, she met me 15 years after that. And that's what she remembered, that I'd made her cross that boundary. I'd made her cross over. And I think that's what she was doing at both an everyday level and at a metaphysical level and at an intellectual level. She was transcending boundaries. And I think that's what made her just so irresistibly beautiful. I mean, she was irresistible. And the way she would then suddenly call up and say something really silly about what was happening in Pakistan. And then she would say, Magar, aap samjhaiye iska matlab kya hai? Ye itni bewakoofi ho rahi hai. She understood. She knew the answer. But it was just that she wanted to discuss it. And she said, itne bewakoof hain log, aise bhi log hote hain. And the other thing about the work on her, so for the last 5 years, we were trying to pull her work together, pull out extracts from her different works. Tilak knows about it, and certain unpublished pieces that she had. And till January, was it January, when we were actually doing Zoom recordings, Sara and I, where she was talking about her childhood, and I knew her family as well, and we were talking about Pakistan and how to bring this work together, and pieces that she'd written on friends who passed away, some other personal pieces. And I think that Tilak knows all about it. So I think with the guidance of, you know, her students, with Azra, because nothing on Sara can be done without them, I think to put it all together and yes, complete that work that we had started of bringing it together. And in the last Zoom call that I had with her, In fact, I had to request her carer. I rang up and I said, please don't tell her, but turn the camera off, because I couldn't bear to see her. But there she is, a part of all of us, and she's touched our lives in more ways than perhaps we can even understand. But of course, I mean, just because of how important she is in the world today, I mean, her ability to transcend borders, her ability to transcend difference is so important. And I can understand why somebody like Azra, who so feels the pain of others, that why, Azra, you and her connected, and why you worked on Ghalib. And she was just a fantastic human being. She was just an amazing human being, and how privileged all of us are. It's really, it feels like a moment of epiphany to have known her.
And I think it's only appropriate, regardless of whether she transcended boundaries. I mean, she was a Pakistani who wanted to transcend that as well. But I think given that, I think one thing that's far less controversial than a biography project is our chairs in Sara's name, so that we can commemorate this woman. I think that this is an extremely important thing that we must move towards. I think in Pakistan, there ought to be not one, but more chairs in her name. Yes. And that we should, in our own ways, keep her alive, because I think she is going to be an inspiration for so many younger people in the years to come. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important for us to do something there as well, quite apart from work on her. And mm-hmm. I wonder whether there are any thoughts there. Azra, what do you think? You think that's a possibility? And certainly in Pakistan, it should happen right away. It might be more difficult doing it abroad, but certainly in Pakistan, it should be done.
I could not agree more with you, because we have never had an academic figure of her stature in English so far from Pakistan. So absolutely anything to acknowledge that would be fantastic. I would love to hear what Tilith has to say.
Can we get on Tilith? Can we try to get Tilith on? Yes, please do.
On video?
Yes, no, or just to hear, or whatever you can do.
Audio is open.
Audio is open.
Huh?
Oh, can I just start speaking?
Yes.
Yes, please, Tilith. Welcome.
Oh, hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Those such wonderful words. Like Aisha said, they were a feast. I've been enjoying myself and regaling myself on your words. Aisha, your question about a chair or a number of different chairs is a fantastic one. And in my early discussions with the principal of Connect College, they are certainly very, very keen on establishing such a thing. So I suggested starting, I wasn't as ambitious as a chair. All I was saying was I would like to establish a scholarship for young women in Sara's name. And this is actually a legacy from Sara herself, because for years we'd been saying we have to go back and establish scholarships, not in our mother's name. Surya Suleri scholarship and an Ifat Suleri scholarship. And Sara was quite keen on the scholarship in Ifat's name to be in the theatrical, so some kind of a dramatic scholarship. Ifat was a fantastic actress as well. So I thought, well, why not do the same for Sara? And when I spoke to Dr. Ruxana David at Connect College, she was very keen on the idea of a scholarship, but then she said, why don't we take this further and think about establishing a chair in Sara's name? So that's the start. But of course, I think it should be bigger and wider than that.
Well, thank you, Thila. That's really very interesting information. Thank you very much. And I just have one last question, which is, where is the, I mean, you know, Chini's just informed us, and I talked to Chini about this as well, about the unpublished work. I remember listening to Sara many, many years ago at a seminar where she read this fantastic piece, hilarious piece on mangoes. I mean, a passion that Ghalib had, I had, we all have, and Sara did too. I mean, I want to hear that piece again. And I wonder, Thila, whether you know what I'm talking about. Does it exist? And she never published it, but it was fantastic. So, I mean, these need to be printed. I mean, Chini, if you're there still.
Yes,
Do you know
yeah.
which? The mango one, have you got that? The one
I
on
haven't-
mangoes.
No, we have to go through a whole stash.
We have to go through her work. I mean, because
And-
there's unpublished work.
And sadly, I was supposed to meet her in 2020 April. I've still got my ticket to Boston, and COVID happened. So it's. I think Tilat and I will get down, and we will go through the papers. But I think it will be good to have a kind of select group to work on that, because what we were looking at was we wanted to get everything together.
Sure, of course. I'm so
And
sorry.
then we were going to put a volume together, and sort of extracts from Meatless Days, extracts from Boys Will Be Boys. And she's actually talked to me about that in interesting conversation on that, about her father and the book. And then, of course, a Rhetoric of English India, and so on. But and the papers, there's so many papers from the various journals. So we have some material together, but I think we need to focus and get it done. And there are, and I think that once I have permission from Tilat as well, because Sara's not here. So, I mean, the material that she has sent to me, I have that, but I feel a bit hesitant to talk about it at this point in time. And I feel that, you know, Tilat and the family and Sara had spoken to Tilat about it. So Tilat knows about the project. So that we really need to focus on it and see how it can move forward. But it certainly needs to be done. And the idea of a chair in her name would be absolutely amazing. And obviously one would have to fundraise. And I think that these universities are not averse to South Asians raising money, notwithstanding that they've raised so much money from us. But I mean, Oxford has just got an Allama Iqbal chair. And they've instituted a lecture as well, and so on. So I think there are ways of fundraising for that. And I think people with Yale connections should find out and test waters and see how Yale will feel about that. And I think that's a superb idea. And
well, I mean, my first point is that I think Yale will be a more difficult ask, but I think in Pakistani universities, they should be, so that they need inspiration more than anything else. And I think Sara needs presence there as well. That was my idea. I think it'll be easier to start in Pakistan and over a period of time. Shugata, please go speak up. Then Shugata wants to ask a question.
Well, I mean, after half a dozen magnificent tributes by Pakistani women, it's actually superfluous for anybody else to speak. And I, in fact, wondered for a moment whether whether a man should speak on this occasion. Since Daniel decided to speak up, I'm emboldened to say a few words of tribute from a larger South Asian, Indian Ocean perspective. I'm sure Aisha brought Meatless Days to my attention first, but the person who told me that this book is an absolute masterpiece was my mother.
Also literature.
And she was, of course, a professor of English literature all her life. And she also wrote, blending memoir with scholarship, travel with history, and so on. You know, I first got to know Sara in person at Yale. I was there as a fellow in the very first year of the Agrarian Studies program run by Jim Scott. And I met Sara. And I have to say that I've always encountered the Sara that has been described by Aisha as soft and sweet. I didn't ever quite encounter the teacher or the scholar who might offer at least a small degree of intimidation. But I wanted to also tell you about an occasion. This would have been in the mid to late 1990s, right here at Tufts University in the ASEAN auditorium. For some reason, you know, Aisha was away, I think, in Pakistan. And I had put together a symposium on modernity, history, and the state. And since in those days, there were two scholars in the American Academy from Pakistan who could be invited, and one was away in Pakistan. The panel lacked balance, to put it mildly. There was Ranajit Guha, Amartya Sen, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, Partha Chatterjee, and myself sort of bringing up the tail, but Sara was there. And I had wanted to keep our origins a deep, dark secret, but Gayatri gave it away, saying that, you know, most of the panelists here grew up in Calcutta within a 2-kilometer radius, albeit in different decades, you know, of the mid-20th century. But I just wanted to say that Sara, of course, more than held her own against these Indian scholars and the Bengali mafia, as we are often referred to. But she got on very well with the Bengali scholarly mafia. But again, it struck me that just like the essay on mangoes, I mean, she had a written text which she delivered on that occasion. And if one were able to find it, I mean, remarkable. And so many of you had written up something, and these were so beautiful that they not only need to be disseminated in the form of the recording that we have on Zoom, but they really ought to be published, at least as a collective tribute to Sara. And I was just wondering, when did I last see Sara in person? And it may well have been on the occasion of the tribute that we gave to another great Pakistani woman, Asma Jahangir, and she came.
Despite not being well, she came on, she was extraordinary. Yeah. She spoke really well.
Yeah. And one last thing, you know, she never said no to us. And Aisha and I would often invite her to dinner. And when she was not well, she couldn't come, but she never once told us that she couldn't come. And instead of her, of course, in the evening, some flowers would arrive. And so that was the kind of person she was.
There's one thing I want to add to this wonderful story. And, you know, yeah, absolutely. She would always say, I'll be there. And then last minute, she couldn't come because she wasn't well. But one day she called me, it was my birthday, and she wished me a happy birthday and said, I've asked them to plant a tree in your name. Oh, I mean, that is some of the sweetest things. I mean, you know, how can you, I mean, for me, she is just a very sweet person and a very thoughtful, warm, and I would have bouquets arriving for occasions, happy and sad. So Sara was a very generous woman, very thoughtful individual. And you know, what can I say? But I think we've done what we had to do. It's a good closure, Azra. I'm glad I'm here with you. So we didn't have an occasion. So I think this is the best we could do in this pandemic situation. And thank you again. And let's try and do something further. I think Chini, I think we're all connected, and I think I'm going to continue to talk about this and do something, maybe a combination of work on, a collection of her unpublished work, but also some of the memories. I think some of what you had to say, I think should be put together. You know, what the two, and Azra's was just outstanding. So Azra's we want a transcript. So Azra, thank you. Amreen, thank you. Can't thank you enough. And Shazia, thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. For
No,
organizing.
but it was really, it was really tremendous. It feels good. I feel it's like a closure of kinds that I haven't had. So I'm really glad that you were able to do this. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aisha.
Bye. Thank you.